Hello and welcome to episode 42 of the Chall podcast, a Call of Duty esports podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we will be recapping the second major in the Call of Duty League season, and what a major it was. We saw a lot of upsets. One of the most surprising results in terms of grand finals that we've seen in the CDL so far. But before we do any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. Like you said, it was a really hectic weekend full of a lot of upsets and some juicy storylines. So ready to hop right in.
They really followed in the footsteps of March Madness. Like we got so much madness in the CDL major, and the big story obviously are the winners, the LA Guerrillas, and I'm not that is a real thing. The Guerrillas, they won the second major this season. I was telling you a little bit before we started that if I had told you that a dark horse won, you like the Guerrillas would probably be your last team that you would pick. And even if I told you that LA won, you would probably not pick the Guerrillas as your first choice. You just would have thought that the Thieves figured out their issues and made a run. But the LAG just they pulled off an incredible run. And it wasn't because they had a strong winners bracket performance. They actually dropped down to the losers bracket immediately. They were defeated by the Breach and then proceeded to win five losers bracket matches to get to the grand finals, and then won the grand finals by defeating Atlanta FaZe. So it wasn't like this was an easy path. This was essentially the hardest path, other than they did not play OpTic, is essentially the only way that this could have been more difficult for them. I just want to get your thoughts on the whole idea. We'll go and we'll break down their run, like after you get done. But I want to get your thoughts on your feelings on LAG's historic win.
You didn't even bring up the point that this isn't even their intended starting roster that gets
Yeah,
the win here, right? So,
it would have been
um,
crazy if they had won even with gunless, which is
yep.
pretty insane.
But yeah, so that's the big part for me is that they have a last minute substitution with amateur player Spark coming in to play in place of Gunless due to illness reasons. As we said last podcast, say it again, hope Gunless has a speedy recovery and hope he's doing well with everything that's going on with him. Um, but yeah, and then they go on this historic losers bracket run, arguably one of the best of all time. Slasher, as he put it himself, that he is he's crowned himself the king of the losers bracket now and the king of LA, which that's kind of funny considering his history with
Hmm.
the Thieves last year and everything like that. So, yeah, this was completely unexpected. Um, I'll be the first to say it. Last week when we were doing our show previewing the major, we did a little different format where we went like team by team talking about their circumstances and their seeding heading into the major and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure that the Gorillas were the team we talked the least about because I personally just had absolutely no expectations for them, and it was no fault to them. It was just a matter of the circumstance with them coming in with a last minute sub. They had just played OpTic with Spart in the lineup in an online match and got smoked. Like it wasn't even close. Which again, when you're playing the best team at the time, they are on their win streak. What I think it was 12. That was the 12th win. So I think they were on an 11 match win streak,
Mhm.
going up against LAG with a sub. It makes sense that that match wasn't close in particular. But that's all we saw. And then we get confirmation a couple days later that Spart's going to be playing in the major, and we do our show, and it's just like, yeah, it kind of sucks for LAG that this is the situation they're in, but it's the hand they've been dealt, and I wouldn't have been surprised if they got a top 12 finish. Just losing in the first round, losing first round of winners, losing in the first round of winners, then dropping down to losers and losing there too. And yeah, that's pretty much all we said last week, at least to my recollection. So they completely proved me wrong, and um, I think it's safe to say they proved a lot of people wrong. Just because, again, due to the circumstances, I don't think many people had very high expectations for them to even be like a top 6 team at this event, let alone win the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's not like they had this incredible run in multiple game modes. They're an incredible search and destroy team apparently. Like they went 10-2 in this major in search. They were 2-1 on Berlin, 3-1 on Tuscan, 3-0 on Bokage, and 2-0 on Desert Siege. But in hardpoint and control, they were just kind of average, 6-6 in hardpoint and 4-4 in control. So we've talked about it before. Search and destroy is the most important game mode. If you can get to that game 5 and you have the advantage in search, like that obviously gives you a great advantage in the entire series. But it's just for me, it's everything. Like it's just so shocking that a team with essentially a thrown together roster. Spart is their substitute. He has been their substitute all season, but substitutes don't factor into like the teams in the CDL the way it does in traditional sports. It's not like the backup quarterback coming in. They're not in the same practice. Spart is actually playing with different teams. He's been playing in challengers this season as all of the other CDL substitutes, other than like Pristini or whatever. Like those substitutes are essentially there to just in case of emergency, in case one of your players gets injured or gets sick or whatever, and they can come in and they can fill in on a temporary basis. But Spart did so much more, and I think he deserves a ton of credit for like this is a very stressful situation to be thrown into, and he knows, I'm sure, that he's already been in the CDL before. He played with LAG in that first season of the Call of Duty League, and he hasn't been up to the CDL since. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that reputation is a really big thing in Call of Duty and esports in general. If people see you play and they don't see that your teams win, or they see like maybe your stats aren't as good, or whatever the case may be, like there is that idea that you're just not going to get a shot, or it's going to take a really long time to get your next shot. And had Spart had a really bad tournament in LAG, maybe they get 3-0'd by Boston, then they get 3-0'd in the losers bracket and they're out of the tournament. Who knows when Spart's next chance to be on a CDL roster is? But there is a very real conversation that needs to be had now with LAG about, okay, like what do we do? Like if Gunless is healthy, and we do hope that he is healthy by the time that the next set of qualifying matches start for the third major, is it the right idea? Like, does Gunless get his spot back in this LAG roster, or should we go with Spart? I want to get your thoughts on that. I don't, maybe you don't have an opinion on which side they should go on, but like, what do you think a team should do in that kind of situation? Because that has been a topic of conversation in sports. Like, should a starting quarterback lose his position due to injury if the backup does well? I mean, you're a big fan of Tom Brady. He made his entire career on he filled in for Drew Bledsoe, who got hurt, and Tom Brady is now the greatest football player of all time. And like, I'm not saying that Sparta is going to be the greatest Call of Duty player of all time, but this result and this run cannot be ignored. So what are your thoughts on it?
I have a lot of thoughts on it in particular. First off, to touch on what you were just talking about before asking the question, it's not only the fact that Spart filled in as a last minute substitute and they went on to win the event, he was also named the MVP of
Yeah.
this tournament. So it's not like, he was just along for the ride or anything like that. He was literally named the MVP of the tournament and, in effect, the most valuable player of the event. So it's really hard to ignore that. Also, just to quickly touch on what you were saying with Search and Destroy, I can go on into more details about their style later on and stuff too. But I thought it was interesting. It kind of made sense just based on, bringing in the last minute sub. They probably didn't have too much strategies or too many, like play calls or anything really planned out ahead of time. And they played more of a methodical, slow style where They were watching a lot of cuts and pushes and then trying to get first blood with their nades and utility to get info, stuff like that. So I thought that was interesting to watch, especially in the grand finals. And I will say too, I was, head Ego Chall correspondent Trem and I have been noting that Tupac, the S&D coach of FaZe, has been doing some like Money Eights S&D chows and stuff on Twitch. And even before this whole situation with Gunless and Spart filling in for the online matches came up, I noticed that Spart was playing with Slasher in some of those like Money Eights tournaments and stuff. So I did think that was kind of interesting at the time. It didn't make sense to me because obviously like Spart wasn't in the lineup, and I didn't think like Slasher was like it's not like I thought Slasher was really good friends with Spart or anything like that. So it kind of didn't make sense to me at the time. And now thinking about it, obviously them just like putting in the work and stuff like that clearly paid off. But now back on topic with what you were saying, the gunless and Spart debate is one that I am super interested in. I really don't have, a clear cut answer just because I can see it from both sides. Whereas I feel like it's very difficult with the Guerrillas winning their first ever championship with this lineup. I feel like it's incredibly difficult to just say, yeah, thanks for the time, Spark, but we're bringing Gunless back in, and we're not going to use this lineup right now. But at the same time, I could see them because just based on some of the interviews and stuff at the event with ASIM and I think Slasher might have mentioned it too, but I think all of them might have. But like some of the guys on LAG were saying this is for Big P and stuff like that. Like shout out Big P and stuff during their events or during their games leading up to the finals and stuff like that. Like these guys are close with him, um, and I wouldn't be entirely surprised if he did come back into the lineup. But it's just such a difficult situation, and it's probably a decision that LAG was not expecting would be a hard one to make heading into the tournament, right? Because like we were saying, I don't even know if the organization expected to win this event. They probably just thought,
Not a
Spart's going to
chance.
come in, fill in for this major, and then Gunless is going to come right back in afterwards.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's a really tough situation. Also, the type of person Gunless is, he's just like he's a true competitor, I feel like, and he's not someone that I think is gonna wanna like sit on the bench and collect a paycheck. Like if the Gorillas are gonna decide to keep Spart, I feel like he's gonna want to be traded or released to get a chance to compete elsewhere, but I don't know, if that would happen or anything like that. So it's obviously, another wrinkle in the whole thing there. But I also feel like, I don't know. And obviously, we would have to talk to Pierce to get what he thinks, but it's one of those things where, on one hand, I see Gunless being that fierce competitor, loves to compete. He always like tries to do whatever it takes to win, and he's gonna want to be back in the lineup. But part of me even could see him being like, "Damn, this team, uh, just pulled that off without me, and they're really, some of them are my really close friends. Maybe if I take a step back for now and see if they continue to find success without me, maybe that's something he does. I don't know. It's really weird. I can see all of this going multiple ways, and I have no idea what's going to happen. And we're just gonna have to wait and see.
Another thing that should be credited to Spart is his ingenuity, pulling out the Volk and playing with that at multiple times during this tournament. It's pretty incredible. Like that's the thing that kind of goes overlooked because pro players only make up there's only 48 players like starting at one time in the CDL. But in challengers, there are hundreds and hundreds of players around the world that are, playing at a decently high level. And in Spart's case, he was playing at a very high level in challengers. But like there are a lot of different possibilities, and there are different things that these challengers teams and players are doing to try to get a little bit of an advantage on their competition. And I just thought it was pretty cool to see someone like just anyone pull out a different gun. This is the first time that the Volk was used in the Call of Duty League. He pulled it out first in their I believe their second series, if I'm not mistaken. He pulled it out on Control. Maybe it was the first series. Um,
First, yeah.
so that yeah, so he pulled it out very early, and it's not like the Rampart where that gun specifically was the reason that this team is going to be credited for this win, but it's just something to add on to it. Is like there is this ingenuity on Spart's part and for LAG's part to like let him do it, and like other teammates not being like no, like just stick to this other stuff, like don't try to experiment during a tournament. I just think it's pretty cool, and I mean, you would know more about like the inner workings of COD and like play, you play GBs with our head Ego Chow correspondent, and like I just think it's cool that we finally have a player that's like, all right, I'll be the one to pull out this other gun, and now people are probably going to start using it in league play and maybe in GBs depending on the situation. But I just think it's cool that we have that player.
They already are. People are already using it a lot in ranked play, and um, I mean, even Spart single-handedly, shifted the meta
Yeah.
just alone this weekend throughout the tournament. We saw um, at points teams like Boston were using two Volks, TJ and Nero were both using it on Tuscan. Abizi was even pulling it out on points for FaZe. Multiple players were using it throughout the tournament after Spart pulled it out. And I will say there is already some talk about it potentially being G8 and stuff. Don't know how much traction that'll gain, but obviously I am on the side of enjoying more, creativity in the meta and having multiple weapons if they actually fit. But Arcides in particular did tweet today. The Volk is most absurd gun. It does it all. Has strafe. It has fleet, headshot multiplier, go burr, T2 gun ever. So there could be some, the Volk meta could be short lived if the pros decide to GA it, but who knows? Regardless of that, that doesn't take anything away from what Spart and LAG did this past weekend. He saw an opportunity to bring out a gun. He showed what it was capable of doing, and other teams were forced to adapt to it on the fly. And that's obviously not the only reason why LAG won. When you win 10 straight S&Ds in the course of a tournament, that is not due to any single one gun, especially when that the Volk was really only used on Tuscan. It was used on a couple other maps and like spot situations, but it really like uh, was primarily Tuscan. And I don't remember the exact number you said when you were going through LAG's search records and stuff. So I don't know how many Tuscan searches they played, but like when you're winning 10 S&Ds in a row, it doesn't matter what gun you're using, in my opinion. Like that's a very team or coordinated game. And not one gun is going to lead to winning 10 straight S&Ds.
Yeah, so they went 10-2 overall and 3-1 on Tuscan Search for this tournament. I just, I'm not a huge fan of GAs because it just like kind of restricts what people are using. Like I do understand the usefulness of them, and I think that some are necessary, and the best solution is just like developers and the league in general like working with pro players to like create a rule set that makes sense and that restricts like absurdly good guns that don't make sense, like don't have a counter or like perks and stuff like that. But in general, like I don't think that they should GA the Volk. Like, if it's good, then use it. Like, don't be stupid. Just use it if it's good. And I think that the fact that it wasn't GA'd, and I believe it was like the muzzle flash or whatever was like the attachment that made it from like a decent gun where you use it infrequently to a gun that like Spart's using, and like everybody's like, oh crap, like what is he doing that I need to be doing? So a really great performance, and like you said, there's nothing that you can take away from LAG. Like the gun didn't make them win. Like that gun doesn't make them win 10 of their 12 S&Ds, and it doesn't help them beat Atlanta FaZe in the grand finals, which is where I want to go next because you know we talked about it before. There are no advantages in the grand finals of these CDL majors. So Atlanta, who were coming in from the winners bracket after beating the New York Subliners, the Seattle Surge, and then the Boston Breach, Atlanta makes it to the grand finals, while LAG, they're slogging away through the losers bracket. After losing to the Breach, they beat the Toronto Ultra, they beat the London Royal Ravens, they beat the Seattle Surge, they beat Florida Mutineers, and then they avenged their loss. They beat Boston Breach, and to get to that grand final against FaZe, a best of 9 series, and like even with that incredible losers bracket run, I was like, all right, like Cinderella stories. Like in college basketball, they usually have a bad ending. We saw it with St. Peter's. Like they have an incredible run, and then North Carolina's like, no, not today. And then they get stomped out. I figured it was going to be something similar. Even though this is not the strongest and most consistent FaZe team that we've seen in this iteration of the Call of Duty League, they still beat Boston, who they swept Boston in the winners finals, and Boston had swept the Guerrillas in the first round of the winners bracket. So I did take that even with that losers bracket final losers bracket final win for LAG. I still figured Atlanta's probably the stronger team here, and they should win the series. So I went with that pick. I believe you went with that pick, but LAG were just kind of like they were possessed a little bit, to be honest with you. Even after losing that opening hard point, LAG lost Gavutu hard point 250 to 135 to start the series. So like at that point, I'm thinking, well, it's over for you guys. Like like the fact that you're coming in with on this losers bracket run, you're warm, you're feeling like on top of the world, and Atlanta just like destroys you on the opening hard point. I thought it was over from there. But LAG after that point routed off 4 straight map victories. They won on Bokage Search 6-4, Gavutu Control 3-2, Tuscan Hardpoint 250 to 227. They killed Atlanta on Desert Siege Search 6-1. Before Atlanta, they came back. They won their second map of the series on Tuscan Control, and then LAG they rebounded and they won 6-4 on Berlin Search and Destroy. And on that map, Hook, who famously was traded for by LAT. The Dallas Empire bench Hook. He gets traded to LAT. Nadeshot says he's a generational FPS player. You have to go get him. Within like a month, he's benched. Like he comes back up. I think he gets benched again. They eventually trade him to the Los Angeles Guerrillas in the offseason. And in this roster, they haven't had the most success. And I just like Spart is like the biggest thing because he's like the like I don't know how to really say it. Like he's this guy that just like came up, like he did what he needed to do and he helped his team win even by being put in a difficult position. But Hook has been in a very weird situation with like the allegations of like drug abuse, and like he's talked about his mental health and stuff. Like I think that like his story of just the past year or so and him winning this championship with LAG, I think that's an incredible story. You don't have to comment on that specifically, but like tell me about your thoughts on this grand final series, a 5-2 victory for LAG over the Atlanta FaZe.
I think you did a good job summing it up. I mean, I did predict coming into this uh, event that I thought FaZe was going to win it all. I went back against um, OpTic, who, I mean, we haven't really even spent that much time talking about OpTic yet, but we can get to that later. And especially like you said, uh, just looking at the bracket and stuff, when OpTic lose in the first round of Surge, FaZe beat New York. We get another FaZe versus Surge showdown, which has been a tough matchup for Atlanta this year in particular. They lost at the Kickoff Classic, I believe. to start this year, which obviously, doesn't really matter that much. But and then they most recently lost in the online qualifiers before Major to Seattle upset phase in the that qualifier. I believe that one was 3-2 as well. So we do see that rematch for phase here. And there was a little bit of situation with Mac being sick mid-map and map one of that series. We had to have a restart and stuff. And he had a bit of a flu game. He is especially on Bokage Hardpoint in that series. He went off map 4, I believe that was. But then in the end, Atlanta does overcome Seattle. And after that point, it's FaZe versus Boston in the winners finals, and FaZe, like you said, just smokes them 3-0. And I'm thinking right alongside there with you, like this is Atlanta's tournament to win. Like nobody's gonna touch them now. It's over. Um, and to keep this as family friendly as possible, even former COD Pro Enable, there a bit of a viral clip was going around Twitter, where Zuma asked him what he would do if LAG made a losers bracket run to beat Atlanta in the finals, and he said he would do something on stream that's not PG-13, and
Something that he would have to remove his rib for, I believe.
and yeah, so I mean that just goes to show what a lot of people were thinking. And then, like you said, we get to this grand finals. LAG go on that run to get to the finals, and they have to go up against FaZe, and map 1 FaZe dominates it right away. And it's just I'm sitting there right alongside you thinking, this is over. Like this FaZe has got this in the bag. But then for LAG to rattle off 4 straight maps there, and you could make the argument that they could have closed it out in the Tuscan Control. That one, FaZe's second map win there on Tuscan Control, it came down to the wire because Atlanta was on offense in the 5th round, and Celium, they only had, I think it was like 3 lives for FaZe, and I think it was a 3v4, and then somebody gets a kill on FaZe to like make it a 3v3 as time expires, but then LAG is pushing in while Atlanta was capturing it, and they kill Celium as the tick goes through, and FaZe gets the win. So like if they kill him a millisecond sooner, like the cap might not happen, then Guerrillas just close it out in that, and it's a 5-1 even. Um, so like you could make the argument that this could have been a 5-1 to the point where Atlanta only wins map 1, then Guerrillas just rattle off 5 in a row and end it there. But obviously, we've talked about their S&D streak where they closed things out in Berlin in the next map anyway to get that first win. So yeah, that was impressive. And another note to go along with that is that both majors this year have been 5-2 score lines in the best of 9 grand finals. Both involve FaZe losing 5-2, and both involve the map 7 being the decisive map, was Berlin Search and Destroy. And both Berlin Search and Destroys ended 6-4 in favor of the team to win the event.
I think it's interesting. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe just the way that the game modes are set up, and
That's the vetoes, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, you can
like
only veto one hard point because of the small map pool in this. So, um, yeah, I don't, no, it doesn't really matter end of the day, but I just,
mhm.
it was something I noticed when looking at the results for both the 2 majors. So I thought it was cool to point out.
We've talked about Atlanta, we've talked about LAG. I think, we got to talk about OpTic because that was the team that, even though you picked Atlanta, you were basically picking Atlanta because you knew I was going to pick OpTic and you kind of wanted to be a little
Eh,
bit different. You don't have to admit it, but it was that was reality. But it was undeniable at least that OpTic was the hottest and best team coming into this tournament. They were on a 12 match win streak. They had beaten Atlanta multiple times. I believe they had beaten London at least once, and I consider London, like before this tournament at least, I thought they were solidly the 3rd best team in the league. They had beaten Boston, who I thought was like 4th or 5th best. So like it wasn't like they were just beating up on these bad teams. They were actually beating teams that were good, and they did it convincingly most of the time. So they came in with a 12 match win streak. They play the Seattle Surge in the winners bracket first round, and they get swept by Seattle. Seattle of all teams, like I think that the Surge, they are definitely a team that can upset you, as Atlanta can attest to from that first qualifying match before Major 2. But Seattle is just a very inconsistent team at times, and they showed up for this match against OpTic. A 3-0 with Seattle is kind of insane just to think about, because OpTic had just played them like a week or so, maybe a week and a half before this, and they lost that opening hard point, I believe, on Bokage, but then they beat them pretty, like, maybe not convincingly. Like, it's not like they just like steamrolled them. I'm pulling up the stats right now. So yeah, it wasn't like a convincing one, but they won the rest of the map. So they lose 250 to 207. I'm talking about in the qualifying match. 250 207. Seattle wins on Bokage. Then OpTic wins 3-6 on Bokage Surge. Tuscan Control goes 3-2 for OpTic, and then 250 to 240 on Tuscan Hardpoint. So it's close, but again, like, a lot of maps are close, and OpTic has just made a habit of being able to clutch up all these maps and win it when they need to. So like, that was then, but then we get to the major, and here we go. Seattle, they win 250 to 159 on Bokage. So the same first map hard point as that qualifying match. Seattle, like, very convincingly wins. Tuscan Search 6-4 for Seattle. And then the most surprising part, obviously, is 3-1 Tuscan Control for Seattle, because OpTic has been the best control team. I think they had won like 15 or whatever straight control maps, something so stupid and so good. But 3-1 Tuscan Control for Seattle, and that's the end of the series. Sib on map 3 drops 34 kills for the win. And Pred had 11 for that search and destroy, and Mac even, so this was pre-flu game, but he had 35 kills in that Bokage hardpoint. A pretty disappointing series for Illy, and just a disappointing series, obviously, for OpTic as a whole, because one player won't make you lose, like, somewhat handedly to Seattle. What do you think of? We'll talk about it. OpTic's other matches right after this, but I want to get your thoughts on this match in particular, because we've talked a lot about Seattle this season.
Yeah, I think, similar to Florida, it's kind of been, Seattle has been in that inconsistent camp where, they've shown flashes of greatness, and flashes of what they're capable of doing, and at the other time they've gone on their losing streaks, and um, it really came down to what form of that particular team we're going to get on each given day. And Seattle came out firing right away here. I did see on YouTube earlier today, like one of those like COD clips channels. It was like something with Rambo talking about the Seattle match in particular. And I watched it, but I don't remember it too well, which is just pretty bad on my part. But I do know he like was mentioning that like he took responsibility for the vetoes because, as you mentioned, in their online match they played that Bokich hardpoint, and um, they got like heavily outslayed in that one and only lost by like 40 something points. And Rambo's justification was like, okay, if we just don't get outslayed that heavily and it was that close of a game, if we keep the slaying numbers a little closer, we should be able to take it. Um, and I think that's like was mainly what he was saying. I could be wrong, and obviously, if anybody listening wants to go check it out, I'm sure if you just like Google like Rambo talking about Seattle versus OpTic, it'll come up. But um, yeah, obviously that was a very surprising result. Just the first day of Major 2 in general was kind of surprising due to the fact that it was 4 3-0s. And this OpTic Seattle match was the last match of the day on Thursday. So we had 3 3-0s coming into that. And everyone was like, no, we're not going to see another 3-0 if, unless OpTic 3-0 Seattle. And then Seattle wins map 1. They're like, well, no, we're not going to see Seattle 3-0 OpTic. That'd just be ludicrous. But that's what ends up happening. And yeah, I talked about it before. Just the optic, the stereotype of slow starts to tournaments with past iterations of optic and stuff like that. Um, but I've also said, I don't think that's like really fair to say about this team just because there's so many different players on it now and stuff like that. But this was, a slow start. Obviously, they the defending champs getting sent down to the losers bracket right away was definitely um, an unexpected result.
No, definitely. So Optic they beat Minnesota in the losers bracket. To kind of rebound. They win that 3-1. Then they play LAT, and LAT was coming off of a few wins. They had, excuse me, one win. Excuse me. They had beaten the New York Subliners 3-2 in their opening match of the tournament, and this was a really close series. As you know, we've kind of become accustomed to between these two teams. Like I don't think that like LAT is obviously a really talented team, but they're just like very inconsistent. And Optic is a very good team that's usually pretty consistent. But these matches between the two have been really really good. This turned out to be another really good one, 3-2 for Optic, and they advance after losing that opening hard point and the Bokage search, but Optic they kind of rebounded. They were very good in control still. They crushed LAT on Berlin Hardpoint, and then they won Tuscan Search 6-4. We'll get to Optic, but let's talk about LAT because we have them here. This is the second straight tournament where they've been reverse swept to be eliminated from a major. It happened in Major 1 against FaZe. They had them up 2-0, and then things just kind of went off the rails. They weren't able to finish the job, and they, I believe, finished like top 6 in that tournament. They did not finish in top 6. They get knocked out in losers bracket round 2, which I believe is like top 8 maybe. So like not a good performance. Obviously, they didn't win any of their qualifying matches heading in, so they were 0-5. They did win that one match against New York, who is not very good at all, and then they lose to Optic in a series that they definitely could have won. Like, even if you take away control, which is Optic's like expertise, like you got to finish out one of those last two maps to win the series, and they weren't really close on that hard point. They got heavily outslayed. Envoy, for example, had a 17-31 game, but nobody had even close to an even KD for LAT. And then on Tuscan Search, Kenny had 2-10, Envoy 3-9. Even with Octane, who had a really really bad, he had a donut on that first search and destroy map of the series, despite the win. He dropped 11 in map 5 and they still couldn't get it done. So it's not like one player just stuck out as like, oh well, you underperformed this entire time. It just a really weird series. What do you make of LAT? What is the future for these thieves? Because we talked about it on the last show, like 0-5 and then a top 8 performance at the major. That's not something that the Los Angeles Thieves, who have Octane and Kenny and Envoy and Draza, that's not something that they should expect or really tolerate. So what do you think the path forward is for the Los Angeles Thieves?
Yeah, I still don't know exactly what the future holds for them. As I said last time when we were talking about it, I think that at this point it would make sense if they did decide to make a change, especially with the organization's, brief history in the CDL of making multiple roster changes last year. So I wouldn't be entirely surprised if they decide to go down that route again this year. But at the same time, I don't know what the change is that, just salvages this for them. I don't know. If they make a one person change, I really don't know which one for one swap helps improve the team. And even if they make a two-person change, I really don't know which way they go because it feels like Kenny is the guy that the organization wants to build around. So then who do you keep with Kenny if that's what they decide to do? And then what two guys are coming in to replace the other two, whoever you decide not to keep with Kenny? It's super, I think it's just a weird situation that we don't have a clear-cut answer to yet, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. But it is also worth noting they came very close to getting a top 12 finish here. at this event. You could make the
Top
argument that they
six.
should have lost their first series against New York. They pull off the reverse sweep over New York
Oh yeah.
um, before they get reverse swept by
Hmm.
OpTic. So, um, that it's, I guess, top eight's obviously better than top 12, but that still isn't for the caliber of players on this roster. This isn't where most people expected the Thieves to be at this point in the season. So I don't know exactly what change needs to be made or what's going to happen, but over this next little break period, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if they did make a change. And at the same time, if they decide to stick it out, it might not end up working out for them just based on current results. But there's so much potential and talent on that roster where, just literally less than a month ago, we were saying this is the best hard point team in the game. And now they're at the point where they weren't winning any online qualifiers and getting top 8 at the major by, they reverse sweep and then get reverse sweep. Like, I don't know. I just, I think they will end up making a change. I just don't know what it is or how many people or exactly what happens. But um, I feel like with that organization, they expect better results, and I think by the major three qualifiers, something will be different. Maybe if it's a role change, I guess maybe that's like the least, like, I don't want to say least impactful, but I guess that's the most minor change they could make, where they keep the four players and maybe like Kenny moves to a sub or something like that. That's just something I thought of off the top of my head now, but um, I would not be surprised if LAT make a roster change.
I definitely wouldn't be surprised at that either. I do expect them to make a roster change. Um, just based on like what we know about Call of Duty and like how teams work, if they're underperforming, like it's not very often that you have a team that is really missing the mark and what people expect of them, and then they just don't make a roster change and try to write out this roster. Like even with the presumably a lot of money that they're spending to keep this roster intact, because Octane is an incredible player. Like all of them are incredible players, and like Octane was on Seattle as definitively the best player last year, and then Envoy was on OpTic last year. Like I think that they're spending a lot of money to put this roster together, and they're not really getting anything out of it. They're not getting to even a deep part. I don't even know if they're getting to Sundays like at the moment. Like that's not acceptable for LAT, because like they're supposed to be one of the top teams in the league, like based on like viewership and like the number of fans that they have. Like they're in the same tier as like FaZe and like pretty much that's pretty much it. Like they're definitely like the top three most popular teams in the league. So they're gonna get that OpTic treatment where it's like when OpTic doesn't do well, people get really upset at them. Like really kind of crazy stuff that gets said to those players, and I would hate to be looking at their mentions after this tournament. But LAT are kind of in that same camp where they have very passionate fans. They have a lot of fans, and those fans probably aren't going to be very pleased that they just got reverse swept again. And they could have knocked out OpTic, which would have been a great thing for them, and then they would have played Florida, who at certain times looked very beatable. So that entire the rest of the tournament could have been different had the Thieves been able to pull off that victory, but they just weren't. And I do think that a roster change is probably the most likely solution. Well, solution maybe is not a good word because I don't know if it will actually solve anything, but I do think that's probably where we're heading. I know that the coaching has been criticized, but I think we talked about it last time. Like, I don't think coaching has that much effect on it. Like that, this is more of a player issue, in my opinion. And not necessarily like these are the wrong players, but these are, these players are wrong in the moment. Like they're not able to get over this hump apparently, and maybe they will be able to, but it'll be very interesting to watch. And over the next whatever month and a half until qualifying matches start for Major 3, I think the most likely option for them is a roster change.
I will say too, just thinking while you were talking, um, LAG's decision whether to keep Spart in the starting lineup or not could have that could be like the major first domino to fall in
Yeah.
what is potentially a huge roster mania, right?
Hmm.
Because if LAG decides to keep Spart in the starting lineup, it's I don't know if it's safe, but it would make sense if uh, they try to shop Gunless or Gunless decides he wants to, pursue options elsewhere and potentially make a trade. But on the other hand, if LAG decides to go back to Gunless, they could keep Spart, as their sub and just keep him on the bench. But due to his performance at this major, he will be an extremely hot commodity, and a team like LA Thieves could, make a very large offer to LAG and say, we'll give you a ton of money here. Let's make a deal for Spart, and then Spart could end up on a team like LAT. So that decision, whatever LAG decides to do with his lineup, could have a major impact on what is potentially a mid-season roster mania shakeup. And at the same time, if something major isn't done with LAG, like if Spart stays in the lineup, Gunless decides to stay on the bench, or Gunless comes back in the lineup and Spart decides, or LAG decides to keep Spart on the bench, that could also have the effect where we don't see as many roster changes in this upcoming like short month hiatus. So that's also something to keep in mind that I was just thinking about.
Yeah, there's always in the big roster manias, like usually between seasons, there's always that big domino. It's usually OpTic or the Thieves or Atlanta in some cases where that best team, they add a player and then everybody is scrambling to make sure that they have their roster set. We saw it before the first season of the Call of Duty League when Seattle was supposed to have an incredible roster. They were supposed to have Envoy and Arcides as part of their roster, but then things didn't work out. Envoy and Arcides end up going to Chicago with the Huntsmen, and then Seattle is scrambling and all these other teams are like, holy crap, like let's make sure we have our players so like Chicago or Atlanta don't try to take them. So I do think that in this scenario, at least, we have that situation with Spart and Gunless. Maybe one of them will be on the move to another team. I do think that makes the most financial success. I'm not like Stan Kroenke is a billionaire, so if he, depending on how much money he puts, he and his other their partners or whatever put into LAG and like the parent company for them. I mean, that could be something that we see about selling high. Like Spart's stock really cannot be higher at the moment. Like everything worked out in his favor, and he deserves to get paid. LAG probably thinks they deserve to get paid for having him on their roster, and maybe if they ship him out, or Gunless, because Gunless's stock is still pretty high relative to where it was maybe a year or two ago. So I do think that a roster change, depending on what LAG does, could be in the future. But yeah, that's a very interesting point. I do want to talk about Florida because they're one of the teams that we haven't talked about so far, and I think their run is also very surprising. To beat London in that winners bracket round one match, it's very Florida of them because we've talked about it. They're an inconsistent team. At times they look like one of the best teams in the league, and at other times they look like they're challengers players. So it's like or a challengers team because there is talent on this roster. I don't want that to get confused, but like they just seem to lose maps that they shouldn't lose, and they win maps where you're like, are they better than OpTic? Like that's kind of the situation that they're in. And we learned that in this scenario where they play OpTic in the losers bracket, they were in fact better than OpTic. And like that is a pretty crazy thing to think about. You know, well, I'm not saying that they're better in the overall sense, but they beat them. So like that, granted, there was a little bit of
Yep.
Activision cheese that was placed right on top of that burger that was that 3-1 win from Florida. But I mean, it was an impressive win, even with that spawn, the squad spawn stuff, which is just stupid, and Activision should really stop doing it. Like we just need to get away from it. I thought we were gonna be done with it after everybody like completely hated it in Modern Warfare, but it's just kind of been that's the status quo now, and that's just something that teams have gotten used to. But let's talk about this Mutineers series. So they beat London in that first round, then they lose to the Boston Breach 3-2 in a winners bracket round two. They drop down the losers bracket and they play OpTic in the losers bracket quarterfinals. Um, I mean, I think we both picked OpTic, and I was thinking like, man, I'm gonna pick OpTic, but I just know Florida's gonna do like if they do something stupid here and they win, I'm gonna be really mad. And I was in fact pretty mad after Florida went beat OpTic. They win 3-1. What did you think of Florida's victory over OpTic?
Um, yeah, so that was the only thing I was thinking there was that, who knows what happens in that Florida versus Optic series if, things go the way 99% of the time you expect them to happen there. And for those who might have missed the match or whatever, first map in the Florida versus Optic series was a Gavutu hard point. P1 is the ring hard point, and Optic gets 4 down. Shotzi was the one who died. He spawns up on one side of the map. I think, looking at the mini map, it's on the right side of the map. Um, and because Optic got 4 down, they're starting to push forward towards the left side of the mini map. And um, because of that, they're expecting the Florida players to spawn on that side of the map because they hadn't crossed like the 50-yard line, the imaginary line on the map, kind of dividing it by that. And it turns out Florida spawns behind where Shotzi had just spawned, and then they're able to push in. It gets chaotic in the hill for a little bit, and Florida comes away with a 2-point victory. Um, but regardless of that, like you said, they dominated the Berlin search against Optic. Skies in particular had a really good game there, and it was a 6-1, and the only round that Optic won in that was when Skies called in his streak, and then I don't even remember what the perk is called in this game, but it's like the cold blooded or ghost perk that like hides you when an AI controlled streak is called in, or a user controlled streak is called in. It doesn't show like the red square or circle around you. Um, Optic put that streak on, so Skies didn't know where any of them are, and they were able to kill Skies while he was in his streak and stuff. So that was the only round Optic won in that search. And then Optic wins the control, which you expect because Optic is a strong search team. So you could say, in theory, if Optic doesn't get the unfortunate spawn there in map 1, they could be up 2-1 in the series at this point. Florida wins game 4. And then, we're looking at a game 5 scenario. Who really knows what happens based on Florida's performance in the search in game 2. So regardless, can't really take anything away from Florida there. They, they can't control where they spawn, so they just, they played it out and, were able to come away with the win. I will say in general, outside of that, and this series in particular, one thing you mentioned to me during the tournament and stuff beforehand that I just thought was interesting is we're seeing a little shift in the maps Florida seems to be playing, because we've talked multiple times now on the podcast, and the community has talked about the composition of Florida's team, which seems to be heavily AR favored, and the team seemed to be playing a lot of Bokage Hardpoint, which is not a very AR favored map. And in this tournament, just going through their series real quick, Florida wins 3-0 against the Ravens. They play Gavutu Hardpoint and Gavutu Control. So obviously Gavutu is the most AR favored map in the game. Then against Boston Breach in the winners bracket, they play Gavutu and Berlin hardpoint. I would say, probably in my opinion for the hardpoints, Berlin's like the second biggest map, or the second most AR dominant hardpoint behind Gavutu. So we're seeing Gavutu and Berlin there. And there was Gavutu control for the respawn in that match as well. And then against OpTic again, we saw Gavutu hardpoint, Berlin search, Gavutu control, Berlin hardpoint. So we were seeing Florida play a lot of Gavutu in particular, and when they weren't playing Gavutu, it seemed like they were playing Berlin, which compared, in my opinion at least, to Bokage and Tuscan, they are definitely more AR favored than sub favored, and that just makes sense to me. You could make the argument that it doesn't necessarily make sense that why teams are letting them play those maps. Maybe it's just because of their early season success on a map like Bokage. Maybe they weren't buying into the success at the start of the major on the maps. I don't really know, obviously, all speculation there, but I just thought it was interesting. We are starting to see what looks like Florida expanding their map pool to a map, in my opinion, that seems to fit their team composition a little better. And obviously, they end up coming in fourth at this tournament, so that this could be something that sets them up for more success throughout the year, either in the form of them continuing to play maps like Gavutu and Berlin and winning them, or teams starting to ban Gavutu or Berlin against them, and then they're still having a map like Bokage they can fall back on where they have seen some success this year.
It's interesting for Florida because not only is the composition something that they I don't want to say that they struggle with because maybe they've gotten kind of used to it, but everybody still talks about it, including us.
Yeah.
Like we still talk about like how do these roles fit because blah blah blah. But I think Ogre 2 even said like on Twitter, he and Enable kind of had a back and forth. I think that Ogre 2 actually deleted his tweets. Like I can't find them. Like maybe I'm just overlooking it. But it was during the tournament. I think it was right after Florida beat OpTic, and they maybe it was after Florida beat London. I'm not sure, but it was essentially like Ogre 2 felt like they were the guys on reverse sweep were talking about something that wasn't reality in case of Florida. He I think Ogre 2 was saying like, we run these weapons and like we're not losing to bad teams, we're losing to good teams. Like we're just like we're on that tough stretch where because we have these predetermined matchups, we're losing to like these top six teams. Like at the major, they lost to LAG, the eventual winner, and they lost to Boston, who I think is probably the fourth best team in the game. In these qualifying matches heading in, they lost to Boston, they lost to Atlanta, and they lost to OpTic. Like those are losses that I mean, we other than maybe that Boston one's kind of more of a toss up, but we expect them to lose those matches. I do think that it's a like my frustration with them is not that they are losing these matches like to Atlanta and OpTic. It's that at times they look like they can beat everybody, but then there are other times where it's like, why are you like? It seems like they played like somewhat randomly to like the level of their opponent, so they can give a run to Atlanta, or they obviously beat OpTic in this tournament, they beat London in this tournament. Like that's very good, but I don't know, like maybe I'm just like kind of pushing this narrative that isn't there, and maybe I'm wrong, like is the thing I'm trying to say. Like is Florida, like where does Florida rank for you in the CDL now? Because we've seen we're halfway through the season, like we're actually at the midpoint of the season, and we've gotten to see them in like a dozen or so matches. They're I don't know where they are in the standings. I think they're like 6 or 7. So like where would you put them in the league so far relative to every other team? Because they have those wins against London and OpTic recently, but like they don't consistently beat those teams. So where do you put them?
That's what it comes down to for me, is just the consistency, and that we've talked about it now with Florida and Seattle. They like kind of highlight it. Um, Aside from the drastic shift in consistency for LA Thieves, I feel like Florida and Seattle are both those like back and forth teams that we've been talking about on multiple instances this year, and you can even see it, just based on their major performances. They got top 12 at the first major, I believe, because they lost to Boston in that series. Yeah, they got top 12 major one, and then they get fourth at major two. So I think that kind of, sums it up to the point where, they're just an inconsistent team, and it comes down to what form of Florida shows up on what given day. And I don't know where I would put them right now. They're a middle of the pack team in my mind. I'm not going to put a tier or a number on it, just because I really don't know. But I mean, yeah, you got the standings pulled up now, and they're tied for sixth. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, like I think maybe I just need to understand like so I came to this conclusion with Boston, I think in the last week of the qualifying matches, but Boston is a good team, but not a great team. Boston is not usually going to beat OpTic. They're not usually going to beat Atlanta, and they're probably not usually going to beat London, at least in the London that we saw before the major. So they're not a top three team in my mind, and the standings prove that they're in fourth place. They're right behind London, OpTic, and Atlanta. But in my mind, like it's a solid fact that they are not a top three team. But for Florida, I don't know why it is. Maybe it's because they've lost to Boston and they've lost to LAG, etc. That now I'm like, oh, I can't like put them in a solid spot within the standings, or I think like they're inconsistent, but maybe they aren't inconsistent. Maybe they're consistently middle like of the road. Like maybe they're consistently losing to these top four, top five teams, and maybe that's just the slot we give them. Like, even with this win against OpTic, there are in some minds of fans, there are probably asterisks involved because of the spawns and whatnot. Um, and they beat London, and there are no asterisks as far as I know in that series. But maybe I just need to lower my expectations. And when they're playing the Paris Legion or they're playing the New York Subliners, I should expect them to win. But when they're playing Seattle or LAT or LAG, maybe I should, look at it as a matchup thing. And like maybe they can't beat those teams as consistently as I like, but maybe they aren't just as inconsistent as I think. I'm not sure if that made sense, but to me, like I think I just need to kind of push back or like push past the idea that Florida is just like this inconsistent team that can't figure it out. It's like they can't figure it out against the good teams, but they're not much different than Boston in that sense. They're just like not as good as Boston.
I just think, obviously we're at the halfway point, but there's still a team we just need to see more out of, right? Because if they continue to be this team that, like you said, they can beat the lower teams, but they can't beat the upper echelons of the league, then where they are is likely where they're going to be, middle of the pack. But we have seen them show the ability, like with this most recent win over OpTic, where they can beat these teams. It comes down to, and with them beating London, like you said, um, it just comes down to what form of Florida shows up on that given day. And I've kind of said that a couple times throughout this podcast now, but I truly, Call of Duty is a game that, can be very day to day. And, a team like Florida that, you know, obviously all the players on Florida are super talented and stuff, but I don't think anyone would argue against the fact that, a team like Atlanta is more talented on paper. Um, where like Atlanta is the type of team with just an absurd amount of talent where you can expect them to come out and win on any given day, and they should win. Whereas a team like Florida, sure they have the talent and stuff, but they have to maybe work a little harder or something like that to try to get the end result, and it's not to the point where they're just overwhelmingly more talented than every single other team they're playing against. Um, that might have been a bad example too, but regardless, yeah, I think this was a good event for Florida. Certainly, um, there was the potential for them to lose to a team like London in the first round, and then potentially get top 12 again at this major if they lost in the loser bracket, and then we'd be talking a very different story about what kind of change does Florida have to make or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
with a fourth place finish at this major, I don't think we're going to see Florida make any changes. Um, so it's going to come down to seeing what Florida is able to do in the staged. I don't want to say staged. God damn it. In the major three qualifiers. That's what I was going to look up too. And Florida did tweet. Was it today? Why is this so low? I just searched Florida and it scrolled me down. Yeah, so earlier today, Florida tweeted like checks our first match of major three qualifiers, and Florida has to play OpTic in their first match of the major three qualifiers, which obviously, we did just see them beat them, but we also saw OpTic win that matchup online before major two. So, yeah, I think the narrative's a little different now with Florida, especially following a fourth place finish. Congratulations to them for proving some people wrong and stuff like that. But we're going to have to see if Florida is able to keep it up throughout the remainder of the year.
So I have the standings up on the screen if you're watching on Twitch or you're watching like the YouTube or Spotify version. Let's just go through these standings and we can kind of touch on some of the teams that we haven't talked about so far during the major recap. Number one, Atlanta FaZe. They have 180 CDL points, 15-5 match record, and a really good map count record. OpTic is not too far behind, 165 CDL points with a 14-4 match record. London are third despite a pretty disappointing result in the major with 130 CDL points. Boston with 120 at fourth. Fifth now are the Los Angeles Guerrillas with 115, which it kind of says a lot about how their season had gone to this point, that even with, I believe you get like 65 points or something for winning a major, they're only in fifth place despite being only one of two major winners. So I think that's pretty interesting. So they are in fifth. And then there's a pretty sizable gap between them and the Los Angeles Thieves, who are tied for sixth with the Florida Mutineers and the Seattle Surge. And then the bottom four currently. So if the season had ended today, these four teams would not make it to the CDL championship. The Toronto Ultra have 60 points, Minnesota Rocker with 50 points, the New York Subliners with 40 points, and Mike Merchant, please cover your ears. The Paris Legion are in 12th place with 20 points and a 2-11 record. It's a tough go to be a Paris fan. I wouldn't know because I'm all LAG. Got the LAG merch in my closet. So I'm all about winners here. But which team are you wanting to talk about? Because I don't want to take up too much of the fans' time because we've already went over an hour and we've talked at length about many of these teams. But I guess which one of these teams is the most surprising? Had the most the most surprising result at the major, or which one's the most surprising standing place going into halfway point in the season?
Um, I would honestly say right now, just to answer that last question, the most surprising team is probably Gorillas in fifth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Coming into the season, I was very high on the roster. I liked the way it was constructed with the SMG duo of Asim and Hook. I thought, Asim being that more aggressive, the route man, as we saw multiple times this event in particular, him doing the dirty work, and then Hook being able to kind of follow him up. It kind of felt like, a close comparison, not close comparison, but you could argue that the play styles kind of mimicked like the Abizi and Simp relationship on paper at least. And then Gunless on the flex, Slasher on the main AR. I like this roster coming into the season, but just performance wise early in the season, it necessarily didn't match up with where they were before getting the 65 points for winning Major 2. So I would say LAG in fifth is probably the most surprising to me. But at the same time, I'll also say New York was in 11th. I think I don't have the graphic and you pulled it down. So
Yeah, I'll pull it
um,
back up.
I think New York is in 11th, right?
Yes, they are.
So I'd probably say that's actually the most surprising because a lot
Yeah.
of people, including myself, had high expectations for New York heading into the season, and obviously they haven't met them. So, yeah, I'll go with New York and LAG for your question there. But yeah, other than that, I guess I can kind of just rapid fire through these teams real quick, as fast as
Yeah,
I
sure.
can, talking about their performance at the major. Obviously, we'll start at the bottom just because there's the least to say about the teams at the bottom, just based on performance. Paris come in down at the bottom here. We only saw them play one series against London. Obviously, we haven't really gone in depth on it, but London did lose in the first round to Florida, which was probably um, not expected by a lot of people and was a considerable upset, I would say. And it was a 3-0, I believe, too, for Florida because, yeah, all the first match days were um, 3-0s. But then London was able to bounce back and they play Paris in this first round matchup of the loser bracket and they win that one. I was just pulling up the stats though because one player we did talk about in particular for Paris was Jimbo, who was criticized for his performance in the online qualifiers since getting picked up by Paris. And Jimbo went 95 and 88 for a 1.08 KD in this series, lost to London. Um, the second best KD on Paris in his like CDL land debut. So just wanted to throw that out there. I think Paris isn't exactly a championship contender team right now, and by bringing in players like Gravity and Jimbo, giving them their shot in the CDL, it's kind of about their development at this point and just seeing what they're able to do um, at this level. So I wanted to point that out, obviously. Moving on to New York now. Probably a little surprising that they came in top 12 at this event only because they were on that recent resurgence since picking up Paul X. I think they went 3-0 with him, I believe, because I think Paul said he
Yes.
went 5-0
Hmm.
in the qualifiers because he went 2-0 filling in for London, 3-0 in New York. They come into this event, they get 3-0'd by FaZe. I don't think that was necessarily very
No.
surprising to a lot of people, but then they drop down to the losers bracket, play LA Thieves, coming in 0-5, and they went up 2-0 in that series. I think that's a very big loss for New York. Probably one they look back on or gonna look back on and wish they could have back to potentially, not saying New York goes on and beats OpTic in the next round
Yeah.
necessarily, but obviously, top 8's just better than top 12. So slightly disappointing. I don't think we see New York make any further changes really. Um, to at least the current lineup, just because they saw some success online before this LAN. So I don't think they would make another change unless they decide to move Clay, obviously, but that doesn't affect the starting lineup at this moment. Um, but yeah, um, nothing else really for New York. Moving on to Minnesota, tough draw for them. This was obviously Major 2 was hosted by them, and due to Seattle's upset of OpTic in the first round, they have to go up against OpTic in their first round losers bracket match, and that's the only match they get to play in front of their home crowd because OpTic ends up beating them. So, a tough draw for them. I want to look at the actual matches. Yeah, so as expected, it was a 3-1 for OpTic. Minnesota wins the search but loses the 3 respawns, and that's just something we've talked about for Minnesota, kind of at length at this point, is that something's not going right for them in Hardpoint in particular or in the respawns, but they're a good search team. So we're gonna have to see. I don't really, Minnesota's kind of that team. I feel like they stuck with this roster now. Wouldn't be surprised if they continue to stick with it and try to work on something. But at the same time, they could elect to make a change. I just don't know what that change would be. So I'd put them in like the maybe category for this midseason roster mania, in my opinion.
Hmm.
Then we go to Toronto. Same story here with them. Very surprising that they get top 12 at the majors, considering the circumstances. Um, they struggled and had to play in the start in the losers bracket. Sorry for this major right away, and due to the way the bracket shakes down, they end up playing the Guerrillas with a sub in their first game after the Guerrillas lose 3-0 to Boston. So that's a match you likely expect Toronto to win, but as
Hmm.
it turns out, LAG takes that one to start their historic loser bracket run. And if I look at that match, similar to what we were just talking about with Minnesota, LAG won that one 3-1, and Toronto wins the search, but LAG wins the respawns. And that's kind of weird to think about that Toronto wins that search just in consideration to LAG's 10 match search win streak.
Yep.
But at the same time, we've considered Toronto a very strong search team. So, and it was a 6-5. So, that was obviously a close one. But regardless, Toronto's hardpoint struggles continue. They're in the same boat with Minnesota, where I wouldn't be surprised if they keep their roster, but they certainly are a team, especially with their recent struggles in hardpoint, and it seems like things aren't getting better in terms of that. They could elect to make a change as well in the midseason here. I will touch on Surge just a little bit because we didn't talk about it too much. We got to see Nikki D play because unfortunately Mac had, his sickness or whatever was going on with him mid-event. So hope Mac is feeling better, all that stuff. But it was kind of cool. You kind of touched on it at the beginning of the show when you were just like casually talking about Spart playing with amateur players and stuff. In what was it now? It would have been loser bracket round 3 where LAG faced Surge. We see Spart versus Classic, who were playing together in amateurs before this situation where Spart had to fill in for Gunless comes up. So that was kind of interesting just from a storyline perspective. But yeah, Seattle obviously had the big win over OpTic. Still, an inconsistent team, but can't take too much away from them because they've played hard against FaZe despite, the situation with Mac, and then they only lose 3-2 with a sub to the eventual champions of the tournament. So they're another team. I was actually more on the boat of them not making a change just because I feel like they're developing, guys like Sib and Pred for the future. So I think they don't make a change in this potential roster mania period. Definitely I would put them like below Toronto and Minnesota
Definitely.
in terms of like potential changes in my mind. But yeah, so that's what I'm thinking with them. I think, it's still similar to Florida, who we've talked about now enough at this point. It's just it comes down to consistency with both of those teams, and we'll need to see more, hopefully with a fully healthy Mac moving into the major 3 qualifiers. I don't think, we've kind of talked about Florida. Both LA teams, Boston, obviously, we haven't talked about them too specifically, but they end up getting third at this
Hmm.
event, which is kind of impressive. We've talked multiple times on the pod now just about Boston in general, the situation with them being the 12th franchise, the last team to be able to make a roster, all that, yada, yada. Good placing for them here. We don't see, I think it was Aches who tweeted it. I'm going to try to pull it up real quick. Um,
As you're doing that, I just want to point out like people were kind of acting surprised that Boston, like they won their winners bracket round 1 match, and then like, oh my god, Boston is playing for top 3. It's like, yeah, they're like the 4th or 5th best team in the league. Like it makes sense that they'd be playing for top 3. Like I don't I don't know why. I just saw like as soon as they beat LAG with a sub, and like obviously that felt different in the moment than it eventually was, but when they beat LAG in that first round matchup, I was like, yeah, like, did people not expect them to get past LAG with a sub? And, like, did they really expect them to fall to the losers bracket immediately? Like, I don't think people are really like paying attention. Like, Boston cannot beat. Like at least consistently, they can't beat like FaZe and OpTic, and usually they can't beat London. But like every other team, they're pretty consistently beating them, and they came close to beating LAG, even who was like as they were going on that big run. So I think that people just need to put more respect on Boston. I definitely wasn't respecting them for most of the beginning parts of the season, but I mean they're very consistent in like that top 4, top 5 range.
yeah, methods in particular has been performing very well recently. I
Hmm.
think that has to, be a main factor in the team, but also, they have the rookies, and even TJ's had his moments for this team. So I think that was a good way of putting it. Like you said, kind of just, they're beating the teams that you expect them to beat, really. But what Aches tweeted was he didn't actually include Boston in the tweet, but it's obviously easy to infer what he's saying. He goes major 1, 5th, 6th, major 2, top 3. Only had to beat Florida, Paris, LAG would sub Florida. No one's fault, obviously, but wild to see that it could be the case. So I think that was before, maybe that was before they had actually beat Florida or something. But regardless,
Yeah,
that's
it
just,
was.
that's how the bracket's shaken down. And we were talking about it even going into the event. The lower half of the bracket for Major 2, it didn't have OpTic or FaZe. So we were both looking at, London and Boston being that showdown for top 3. Didn't work out that way because Florida upsets London. But, Boston just plays the team put in front of them. They beat LAG, beat Florida, and they get top 3. So,
Yeah, I like Patty P, but that tweet aged like milk because like LAG ended up winning the event. The Mutineers, excuse me, they ended up beating OpTic and finishing top 4 and nearly beat LAG as well. Like, and I mean, like I agree though, like in the sense that, or they didn't have to play the top 3 teams that people thought they were like coming into the event, OpTic, FaZe, and London. But I mean, that's just how it goes. Like they lost to FaZe in that winners bracket final, but like Boston can't make London beat Florida, and Boston can't decide to play OpTic in their first round. Like that's just how things work out. And as things did eventually work out, they played a pretty tough schedule in that Florida and LAG performed much higher than we thought they would.
Yeah, I don't think he meant, like
Yeah, I don't.
this
I think he was just pointing it
necessarily. He's
out.
just pointing it out who they beat to get top 3. And like you said, it's not like they beat OpTic and FaZe in London to get top 3. Um, but yeah, regardless, we see Boston get that top 3 finish here, and kudos to them. And on the other side, we have London, who we've just talked about in passing to this point, and I really don't have much to say
There's not
um,
much.
about them in particular. Just they lose to Florida. That's an upset that a lot of people didn't expect. They beat Paris. That makes sense. And then they lose to LAG 3-0, which is very surprising on paper coming into the event, but that's in losers bracket round 2. And, at the end of the tournament with LAG's historic run and being the eventual champions, it makes a little bit of sense. So, I don't know. I still think London is a good team despite my hesitation to pick them for our pick'ems, but um, yeah, we'll just have to, I'll have to see more from London moving forward. Don't really have much to say or critique on their performance at this event in particular. We'll just have to keep our eye on them heading into Major 3 qualifiers. And obviously, we've talked about OpTic and FaZe enough to this point, so that kind of rounds out the event, I think.
Yeah, with London, real quick, like, I mean, they just didn't play very well like this weekend. They were 2-2 in hardpoint, 1-2 in search, and 0-3 in control. Like, it's, oh, we've talked about it before, but like, if you can't win that swing map, it's very difficult to like continue series. And they got swept twice, which I think is more surprising than just losing to Florida and LAG. It's that they were swept on both occasions, and they're upsets by themselves, but losing 3-0 to LAG, who really were just elite in one game mode this weekend, and losing to Florida like this, and Florida's like a good hard point team, and I think in this event, let me look. So Florida was 5-2 in hard point, 2-4 in search, and 3-1 in control. So like it makes sense, but I just expected more of London because to this point they were a very solid team, especially in hard point, and that's been really what's been carrying them through this season so far. Is just they're a very consistent hard point team. They can pretty much beat you on any map like that they usually let into the pool. So like they're 7-3 on Berlin, 6-4 on Gavutu, and 6-3 on Tuscan. Like that's very good, and that's probably why they're able to beat pretty much everybody except FaZe and OpTic consistently. But maybe just like I think that they probably need to improve in at least one more game mode, like in considerable fashion, or they're just gonna have these tournaments where you run into a good hardpoint team and they're kind of countered. Like Florida, is probably a good matchup, or it's a bad matchup for London, but like if they're going up against a really good hardpoint team that has any other game mode in their arsenal, like it's going to be tough for them. Even if like at the moment, I would still say they're like the third or fourth best team in the league.
Yeah,
So
I think that's
yeah,
fair.
it's gonna be difficult for them to beat OpTic and FaZe, but if they just improve a little bit in search or control, I think that they can like solidify their spot in the top 3 or 4. And I mean that's a very good spot going in into the back half of the season. If you can just stay in that top like third of the league, like that's obviously a great spot to be in.
Real quick, I don't know if you have anything else you want to talk about, but just real quick, since we've mentioned roster mania kind of in passing at this point, while looking at the standings real quick. If I was to break it down, obviously, like I said earlier, I would put like Surge like below Ultra and Minnesota in terms of like making roster changes, but like just looking at the standings real quick, I think, in my opinion, FaZe, OpTic, London, Boston probably aren't making any changes. Uh, I would be very surprised if any of those teams make changes.
Yeah.
LAG, inevitably, they have to make a quote unquote change or a decision.
Yeah.
I don't know how you want to categorize that. Then after that, we have LA Thieves. They're in the camp of potentially making a change. We've got Florida and Seattle in the camp of they could make a change, but probably won't. And then Ultra Minnesota, like joining LAT in the potential change camp, and then New York and Paris kind of like, like they could make a
Maybe.
change, but probably won't. So yeah, I'd say, would you agree with those like group breakdowns?
Yeah, so I would say that Toronto is probably the most likely team to make a change. Just like they have Hixie as their substitute, I wouldn't be, and they have two good academy teams. We should mention that there was the Challengers event this weekend, and I believe they have a North American and a European academy team, the Ultra do, and I'm pretty sure that both of them placed top 6 at the event, or top four,
Top
whatever.
four. Yeah.
So top four. The top 4 teams in that challenge event qualified for the Pro Am Classic, which is to take place in like a month or so. I don't know the exact date, but both of those academy teams end up qualifying. So there are a lot of really interesting options if Toronto ends up, making a roster change and they want to stay within the Ultra family, so to speak. So I do think that Toronto is the most likely to make a change. I would say that. Minnesota is probably the next most likely because they're in the same boat as Toronto, that they stuck with the roster that they had from last season because they finished on a really strong note and things just aren't working out at this moment. Like you've had a few months and dozens of matches to kind of evaluate in Vanguard, in addition to the time that they had last season. So I think Minnesota are also pretty likely to make a roster change just based on logic, not any feeling of like reports or anything. I just think like logically it makes sense that Minnesota would make a change. I do think that Paris is probably the next most likely just because they're at the very bottom and it's getting to the point like you're running out of time to even get into the top 8. Like they're only 50 points behind, but that's 5 matches. They've won 2. Like it's not real likely that they win 5 matches to finish the season. So like they kind of need to make a change, maybe a 2-person change again just to kind of mix things up and see. Like Temp is obviously their best player, like I don't think there's much doubt about that, but like other than him, like there's nobody that's truly safe in my mind. So I do think that of the 12 CDL teams, Paris is probably like the third or fourth most likely team to make a change. The Thieves are very interesting, and I do think that they probably will make a change. It's it's like the OpTic situation last year where when they were struggling, I was kind of like, okay, like you make that change, but like, what is that change going to look like? Are you really going to get anybody better? I think it would be funny if Temp ended up back in LAT. I mean, he's obviously boys with Kenny and stuff, but and he's playing very well. I just don't know how the roles fit, and I think that's a problem that happens with Kenny's teams because he's very versatile. So like teams are very like they like him. Like they're like, all right, you're gonna run a sub. All right, you're gonna run a flex. All right, you're gonna run main AR. Like that's like he's so good at everything. So I think that is kind of an issue sometimes because they think they can do whatever, but at the end of the day, like he's best in what he's best at. Like you just kind of have to figure that out. But I do think that they probably will make a roster change, but I'm not sure what exactly that entails. I wouldn't consider whatever LAG does unless they trade someone. Like I don't consider that a roster change if they bring back Gunless or I guess it could be a roster change if they say like we're permanently going with Spart. But either way, like I'm interested to see what they do, and I hope that somebody gets traded and they're able to play in the CDL immediately. Other than that, I'm not sure if there are really any roster changes coming down the pipeline. New York is interesting. I think that they're better in hardpoint with Paul X, but I think the 3 match win streak was not a fluke, but just like they played 3 pretty bad teams like 3 underperforming teams at that time, and that's kind of how it worked out. Like I don't think it was very surprising that they went 0-2 at the major, especially because they played FaZe in the first round. Like that's bad luck, and LAT are like I think I even mentioned in the last podcast, LAT are a decent hard point team and a good one at their best. So like if LAT even plays remotely well, then it's going to be really difficult for New York to win that, and New York didn't win that. So I'm interested to see if the subliners end up making a roster change to try to complete like a 2-team move, or if they move Clayster. I don't know where he would end up because it's very difficult for an AR player. There aren't many options at this point because everybody seems to have their main AR. But again, pretty interesting situation. Seattle could make a change, I guess, but I'm in the same boat as you. Like, just let it ride out. Like, this team is interesting, and they're able to win matches against some top teams. You beat the 2 best teams in the league. You've beaten FaZe, I think, twice if you include the Kickoff Classic, once if you don't, and you just beat OpTic in this one, in this major. So probably no change. Florida, I think they probably should make a change, but like they just finished 4th, so that kind of delays the inevitable, in my opinion. Like that's just something that happens sometimes where a team does really well and they're like, well, we got to stick it out. Like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't feel like it'll work, and I don't like. If your goal is to win a championship, I don't think this team has it. So you should try to improve your roster to the point that they can win a championship. So I would say Florida is out on this one. Florida is probably not going to make a change, but that's just my opinion. And everybody else, like, there's no reason to make a change, even with London's bad performance. Like, you're not going to make that. You're not going to switch out anybody on that roster when you're 3rd in the league and probably still the 3rd best team. Like you're not just like there because like you had a few fluky wins. Like no, you're probably the 3rd or 4th best team in the league. Probably stick with that roster. So that is my opinion on the whole roster mania. Or maybe there really won't be any roster mania. Maybe there'll be like 1 or 2 and we'll just kind of move on.
Yep. You see what Trem said in chat?
No, I will look at it now.
He said when you were talking about Florida, he said they should sign Havoc, and that's why I was laughing hysterically.
I mean, maybe. I don't know who like improves them. I do think that Dave Patty is like the odd man out, unfortunately, because Vivid has a like. There's no like if they get rid of Vivid, like what are we doing here? Like the role makes sense for him in that roster. They probably just need like another flex. Like they need more like a sub flex, like someone that is more accustomed to like I think. I do believe that Ease is still their sub. Um, I just don't know what happens like with this
I don't think
roster.
they do anything because like even because you're saying that
Yeah,
they're like roster construction wise, like you can't get rid of Vivid because he's really the only one true sub you have.
yeah,
Um, they're not getting rid of Awakening because he's basically like the franchise player in my eyes. I feel like he's really good friends with Willett. I think he was like playing with Willett, who is FaZe's coach um, before he made the transition to coaching, and then um, obviously like they decided to go with Willett as the head coach over Ricky Atura heading into the season. I thought Atura was a pretty good coach, but like just um, based on me like just presuming that relationship between like Awakening and Willett, it would make sense. Like they're not moving him.
Yeah.
Skies has literally been on Florida for the past 3 years, so I don't think he's really going anywhere. And then Dave Patty is the rookie pickup for them heading into the season, and he's performed pretty well, especially
Yeah.
statistically. So, despite like roster construction and role questions and all that stuff, I don't see them making a change right now either.
Yeah, I don't see them making a change, but I do think that they like if there was something that they did need, it would probably just be like a glue guy. They need like a Nikki D like in that roster. Not specifically Nikki D unless they just want to hard counter Atlanta, but like in the general sense of like they just need a glue guy. They need someone that is willing to do the dirty work because they have incredible slaying power, and like Vivid is like, you know, this incredible like fast SMG player, like in the same vein as Abizi. So like it, you know, every team is essentially building their roster like in the way that OpTic and FaZe built their roster essentially, and that's just how it is. Like I don't, maybe like Search is like they need a really good Search player, so like maybe Havoc is the guy. I don't know, like I really don't, and I think that's the most exciting thing about roster mania. A lot of times is like you have no idea who's like the perfect pickup. Like nobody would have expected Spart to be like a great sub for LAG, but that's how it works out. And I think we'll have to wait and see, and we'll all be on Twitter waiting for these moments.
I will say though, I would be incredibly surprised if Havoc actually
Yeah.
was picked up by Florida just because of the past, uh, the history and what's happened in the past between Florida and Havoc. Um, Unless you have anything else to talk about, I think
No.
we're good to go. But I will just bring up real quick because I pulled it up when you were talking. Like you said, there was the Challengers Open this past
Yep.
weekend as well at Minnesota, and the top four teams from it qualify for. There's going to be like a pro am tournament at some point this year. I think it's like before stage. Damn it, I said stage again. Before the major three qualifiers happen or whatever. It's going to be
Yeah.
like similar to old school MLG events in the sense where we have like these open bracket teams coming up to play the pro teams and stuff. And in this sense, it's the challengers teams playing against CDL teams. So those four teams, Ultra Academy NA, as you mentioned, won the event. That's Hixie, Vickle, Mohawk, and Scrappy. So although they're NA, I believe Hixie is European, and I think Vickle is Spanish or also European. So
Yeah, I think they're just
um,
based in Toronto.
yeah. And then M7X Electrify came in second. That's Denza, Maple, Wardy, and Wee Man. I recognize the names Wee Man, Denza, and I think Maple was like playing with Tommy at one point, if I remember correctly. I think like Maple played
Yeah.
with Chain and Tommy or something, so I
I
recognize
think
that
he was
name.
on Singularity at one point. Yeah, he was. He was
Maybe.
on Singularity until March
Okay.
2021. Yeah.
And then you have Ultra Academy EU came in third, which is Beans, Furious, Harry, and Vortex. I know Vortex is one of those like old school Epsilon guys with like Dave and Hockey or whatever, and I think Harry is London's sub if I remember Crone's report correctly. Um,
Yes, he is.
and then the big surprise was Strike X coming fourth. That's Gunsy, Fire, Ramby, and Silly. They upset Texas Nation, which is Kismet, Havoc, General, and Brezzy, who were like dominating the challenger scene. And they upset them to get like that fourth and final spot in the upcoming Pro Am tournament. So, congrats to those teams. Obviously, congrats to the Toronto NA squad for winning the Challengers event. Um, and yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, congrats everybody in challengers that ended up qualifying for the Pro Am Classic. This is definitely a really great chance. I believe I just looked it up. It's May 5th to May 8th. If I'm not mistaken, is the Pro Am Classic. And that's like a week before the qualifying matches for Major 3 begin. So we got a little bit of time, a month to really wait on the Pro Am Classic. And in that time period, we have like some like resurgence stuff. And I don't think that they're doing an all-star weekend, or I don't know if they're announcing it or whatever. But yeah, so that's what we have to look forward to. So there might be some inconsistent shows, or we might just do like one or two shows with a different format of kind of like just talking about stuff that like if there's if there are roster changes, or if we just have like some topics that we want to talk about, maybe a mailbag episode. People ask us stuff about COD. That maybe that's something we didn't do in the off season, but we could do in this break. But either way, that does it for the show. Make sure to follow or subscribe to the Ego Chow podcast feed. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Also, leave us a good rating and leave your feedback if you're so inclined. Follow us on Twitter. You're at jbink with 2Ks. I'm at Pres Byers. And the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chow Podcast. The next live show is to be determined, I guess. Either way, we'll tweet it out, so that's probably the best way to keep up to date. When we do a live show, it'll be at twitch.tv/EgoChowPodcast. And yeah, that's pretty much it from me. If I'm not forgetting anything, so take it away, Bink.
Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this absolutely bonkers and wild major this past weekend. If for whatever reason you're watching our show and you weren't able to catch all the matches this past weekend, I highly recommend going back and watching, probably all of LAG's matches, at least, obviously the finals and kind of their losers bracket run towards the end of the tournament in particular. Also some of the upsets like Seattle over OpTic, the FaZe versus Seattle series was pretty good. A lot of great matches if you missed any for whatever reason. So definitely, you can go back on YouTube, watch the VODs very easily, and enjoy the matches if you missed them for any reason. But yeah, it was a great weekend. Had a lot of fun. It was a long and busy one, but end of the day, we got some great Call of Duty out of it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the event. Hope you guys enjoyed our recap of it. Obviously, we did a little bit of a different format this show. So you got any feedback for us, as always, let us know. And other than that, we'll see you on the next one. As always, remember to send the chow.